The man who may have ended the world as we knew it was not a general, not a politician, not a scientist. He was a cook. His name was Albert Gitchell, and on the morning of March 4th, 1918, he walked into a military sickbay at Camp Funston, Kansas, complaining of a sore throat, a pounding headache, and a fever that had crept up on him overnight. The attending sergeant recorded his case as routine. Influenza was common in military camps. Men got sick, men got better. Life went on. The sergeant had no way of knowing, could not have known, that the unremarkable young man standing in front of him with watery eyes and a runny nose was the opening chapter of the greatest biological catastrophe in recorded human history. By the time that catastrophe was over, somewhere between 50 and 100 million human beings would be dead. The oceans of blood spilled in 4 years of the First World War, the artillery barrages, the poison gas attacks, the machine guns cutting down men in no man's land, would be dwarfed by what this invisible passenger carried in Gitchell's lungs that cold Kansas morning. Camp Funston was not a glamorous posting. Situated in the flat, wind-swept plains of central Kansas, it was one of the largest military training facilities in the United States, a temporary city of wooden barracks, mess halls, and parade grounds that had sprung up in 1917 to process the flood of draftees pouring in after America entered the war. At its peak, the camp held over 50,000 men, young men from every corner of the country, drawn from farms and factories and city tenements, packed together in conditions that any modern epidemiologist would recognize as a perfect storm. The barracks were overcrowded. The ventilation was poor. The men slept shoulder to shoulder, ate together, drilled together, coughed on each other in the mess lines. Hog farms surrounded the camp on multiple sides, their pens close enough that the smell drifted over the training grounds on certain winds. This detail, the hog farms, would take on enormous significance decades later when scientists began piecing together where the virus had actually come from. Within 24 hours of Gitchell reporting to sick call, another soldier had shown up with the same symptoms. Then another. Then 5 more. By the end of that first week, over 100 men had been hospitalized. The camp's medical officers were puzzled but not yet alarmed. Influenza came in waves, everybody knew that, and this looked like a bad but manageable outbreak. What they did not know, could not see, was that the virus was already moving. Men recovered, or seemed to recover, and were sent back to their barracks. Men were transferred between units. Troop trains moved men from Funston to other camps across the country. Camp Upton in New York, Camp Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Lewis in Washington State. Each train was a rolling incubator. Each transfer was a new spark thrown onto dry grass. Within 3 weeks of that first sick call, over 1,100 soldiers at Funston had been hospitalized. The numbers were eye-watering, but the mortality rate in this first wave was deceptively low. Most men recovered. Most, but not all. Here is where the history becomes genuinely strange, because Albert Gitchell may not have been the true beginning. The question of where the 1918 influenza actually originated is one of the most contested debates in the entire history of medicine, and it remains unresolved to this day. The Kansas hypothesis, Gitchell as patient zero, Funston as ground zero, was long the dominant narrative, championed by historian John Barry in his landmark work on the pandemic. Barry pointed to Haskell County, a remote, sparsely populated patch of southwestern Kansas, as the likely cradle. In January and February of 1918, local physician Loring Minor had noticed something alarming. His patients were coming down with an influenza-like illness that was unusually severe, unusually fast-moving, and killing people who should not have been dying. Young adults in the prime of health. Miner was experienced enough to be disturbed. He filed a report with U.S. public health authorities, one of the very few such reports filed anywhere in the world at that time. Then, in late February and early March, young men from Haskell County reported to Camp Funston for their military training. They brought something with them. But there is another hypothesis, and it is equally compelling. Across the Atlantic, in a vast British military staging camp near the French town of Etaples, something had been happening since at least 1916. Etaples was the largest British military camp in France, a colossal logistical hub through which hundreds of thousands of soldiers passed on their way to and from the front lines. It housed hospitals, supply depots, training facilities, and, crucially, live poultry and pig markets that serviced the enormous camp population. British physician J.S. Oxford spent years analyzing the historical records from Etaples and became convinced that the 1918 pandemic virus had been incubating there since late 1916, in the peculiar ecological mixing zone created by the proximity of humans, swine, and birds in conditions of extreme stress and overcrowding. The disease that British medical officers were recording at Etaples, a violent respiratory illness they called purulent bronchitis, characterized by a distinctive purplish-blue discoloration of the face, was, Oxford argued, the same disease that would sweep the world 2 years later. The heliotrope cyanosis, the sudden onset, the preference for killing young adults, all the signatures were there, written in the medical charts of 1916, waiting for someone to read them. A third theory points east, to China. Some historians have noted a lethal outbreak of pulmonary disease in China in early 1918, and there is a persistent hypothesis that the virus traveled westward through Chinese and Vietnamese laborers recruited to work in France and crossing the United States by rail. The Chinese Labor Corps, which sent over 100,000 workers to support the Allied war effort, has been cited as a possible transmission vector. However, contemporary Chinese scientists, trained by the Rockefeller Institute, examined the available evidence and concluded that the Chinese outbreaks were endemic disease, unrelated to the pandemic. The diagnosis of pneumonic plague, confirmed in the laboratory with a plague bacillus could be conclusively identified by 1918, further muddied the waters. What the competing theories share is a common thread. The conditions of the First World War created the ideal environment for a catastrophic new pathogen to emerge, mutate, and spread. The war had assembled the largest concentrations of human beings in history, moving them constantly across continents and oceans, subjecting them to physical exhaustion, malnutrition, and the chronic stress that suppresses immune function. The trenches of the Western Front were not just a military disaster, they were a biological disaster in slow motion, a petri dish on an industrial scale. Whatever the precise geographic origin of the virus, the war made its global spread not just possible, but inevitable. The science of what the virus actually was remained profoundly confused throughout 1918, and this confusion killed people. In 1892, the German bacteriologist Richard Pfeiffer had isolated a bacterium from the nasal secretions of influenza patients during the great 1889 to 1890 pandemic, and declared it the causative agent of the disease. This organism, Haemophilus influenza, still bearing the name that reflects this early misidentification, became the accepted scientific consensus. By 1918, the most sophisticated medical laboratories in the world were still working from this assumption. Doctors who could not consistently isolate the Pfeiffer bacillus from their 1918 patients were confused, not enlightened. They assumed their technique was faulty, their samples inadequate. The idea that the true culprit might be something far smaller than any bacterium, a filterable virus, an infectious particle so minute it passed through the finest laboratory filters available, was on the scientific frontier. Barely speculative theory rather than established fact. The practical consequence of this confusion was catastrophic. There was no effective treatment, because the treatment being attempted, targeting bacteria with the limited antimicrobial approaches available in 1918, none of which approached the efficacy of later antibiotics, was aimed at the wrong enemy. The legendary William Osler, the most respected physician in the English-speaking world, was still recommending bloodletting as a treatment for severe pneumonia. The germ theory of disease was less than 40 years old. Virology, as a discipline, barely existed. The men and women dying in the spring of 1918 were dying in a medical dark age, tended by healers who had no real understanding of what was killing them, and no tools to stop it, even if they had. And yet, despite all of this, the confusion, the ignorance, the total absence of any effective countermeasure, the first wave of the spring 1918 influenza was relatively mild. Relatively. Thousands were hospitalized, hundreds died, but the case fatality rate was comparable to severe seasonal influenza. People got sick, most recovered, and by late spring, the wave appeared to be subsiding. Military commanders and public health officials, already overwhelmed by the demands of the war, filed it away as an unfortunate but manageable episode. Some would later describe this moment as the point at which the world had its one chance to understand what was coming, and looked away. Because something was happening inside the virus as it spread through those millions of human bodies in the spring and early summer of 1918. Influenza viruses mutate constantly, their RNA genomes subject to copying errors with every replication cycle. Most mutations are neutral or harmful to the virus, but occasionally, rarely, catastrophically, a mutation emerges that gives the virus a decisive advantage. Something like that appears to have happened in the summer of 1918, in the bodies of soldiers on the Western Front, in the packed hospitals and transit camps of France and Britain, in the troop transports crossing the Atlantic. The spring virus and the autumn virus were related, but they were not the same. The autumn virus was something new, something worse, something that would make the spring outbreak look like a rehearsal. The evidence for this transformation can be read in the immunological record. Survivors of the spring wave, those who had been infected by the milder first variant, showed measurable protection against severe disease when the second wave hit. Their immune systems had encountered something similar enough to provide partial resistance. This is strong evidence that the two waves shared a common ancestor, that the spring virus and the autumn virus were evolutionary relatives. But the partial nature of the protection, the fact that spring survivors could still become ill in the autumn, even if they were less likely to die, suggests that the virus had changed significantly in the intervening months, changed in ways that would make it incomparably more lethal. It was changing as it moved, as viruses do, copying itself billions of times in millions of hosts, accumulating mutations, some of which, by the blind, indifferent logic of natural selection, happened to make it better at killing. Not because killing its host benefited the virus. In evolutionary terms, a pathogen that kills its host too quickly is actually at a disadvantage, because a dead host cannot spread the infection. But the peculiar conditions of military medicine in 1918 may have inadvertently selected for lethality. Men who were moderately ill were kept in their barracks, continued to drill and travel and mix with other men. Men who were severely ill were sent to field hospitals, where they were packed together with other sick men. The sickest patients were concentrated in the places with the highest population densities, while the mobile, active soldiers, the vectors, were the ones carrying the virus across the world. It was, in a terrible sense, evolution on a leash, being pulled in the worst possible direction by the specific conditions of industrial warfare. By July 1918, the virus had reached virtually every corner of the inhabited world. It had crossed the Atlantic to Europe aboard troop ships. It had moved south through North Africa, east to Bombay, further east to China, south again to Australia. A world connected by war was a world connected by disease. The same ships that carried ammunition and reinforcements carried the virus. The same rail networks that moved troops to the front moved the pathogen from city to city. In an age before air travel, before the modern global supply chain, the First World War had created a transportation infrastructure of unprecedented scale and speed. And that infrastructure was now serving the virus perfectly. What almost nobody understood in the summer of 1918, what nobody could have understood given the state of medical knowledge, was that the worst was yet to come. The mild spring wave had been the prologue. The real story was about to begin. The dates are burned into history with the precision of artillery coordinates. August 22nd, 1918. Brest, France. August 24th. Freetown, Sierra Leone. August 27th. Boston, Massachusetts. 3 port cities on 3 different continents, all hit within 5 days of each other. The simultaneity was not coincidence. It was the geometry of military logistics made lethal. The same ships, the same trade routes, the same troop movements that were supposed to win a war, now delivering something far worse than any German artillery shell into the heart of the Allied world. The mutated virus had found its transport network, and that network was the most efficient in human history. What had happened in the months between the spring wave and this August eruption remains one of the most chilling episodes in the history of virology. The virus had not disappeared during the summer. It had been circulating, replicating, mutating in the bodies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers crowded into the camps and field hospitals of the Western Front. The trenches of France and Belgium were laboratories of unintentional biological engineering. Men weakened by gas attacks, by malnutrition, by the chronic psychological terror of artillery bombardment, by infected wounds and dysentery and lice. These men were the medium through which the virus ran its merciless evolutionary experiments. Their compromised immune systems offered less resistance, which, paradoxically, allowed more viral variants to survive and compete. The trench system, stretching hundreds of miles in both directions, was a continuous corridor of human misery that the virus could travel along indefinitely, sampling populations, finding new hosts, accumulating the genetic changes that would eventually produce something monstrous. Military physicians conducting autopsies on soldiers killed by this second wave were struck speechless by what they found. The lungs were not simply inflamed, as in ordinary pneumonia. They were engorged with fluid, hemorrhaging, in some cases virtually liquefied. British Army doctors described the pulmonary damage as resembling the effects of chemical warfare, not unlike what mustard gas did to the respiratory tract. The heliotrope cyanosis that had been noted in some spring cases was now ubiquitous. Men went blue. Their faces, their lips, their fingernails turned the distinctive dark purple blue of severe oxygen deprivation, as their waterlogged lungs failed to extract enough oxygen from the air to keep their tissues alive. Dr. Victor Vaughan, dean of the University of Michigan Medical School and a colonel dispatched by the Army Surgeon General to investigate the outbreak at Camp Devens in Massachusetts, witnessed hundreds of young soldiers being carried into the wards in groups of 10 or more. He wrote in his memoir that he saw their faces turn blue, watched them drown in their own fluid, and confessed that the experience shook his faith in medicine's ability to do anything useful at all. Vaughan was not a timid man. He was one of the most experienced medical officers in the United States Army. He was terrified. Camp Devens, about 30 miles west of Boston, was one of the first American installations hit by the second wave with full force. In the first week of September 1918, the camp reported over 6,000 cases of influenza. The hospital, designed to handle a few hundred patients, was overwhelmed instantly. Men lay on cots in the corridors, on the floors, outside in the open air. Nurses and doctors worked until they collapsed, and then, in many cases, became patients themselves. Medical staff were dying at a disproportionate rate. Proximity to the sick, combined with the sustained exhaustion of working 18 and 20-hour shifts without adequate protective equipment, made them among the most vulnerable people in the country. The virus did not discriminate between the healers and the dying. If anything, the people who tried hardest to help were the ones most exposed. From Devens and the Boston Navy Yard, the virus spread inland and south with terrifying speed. The United States in September 1918 was a country in motion. Millions of men moving between training camps, shipping out to Europe, traveling on leave, working in munitions factories and shipyards in every major city on the eastern seaboard. Every one of these movements was a potential transmission event. The military railroad network that connected the great training camps of the interior to the embarkation ports of the coast became a continental distribution system for the pathogen. By the end of September, virtually every major city in the United States was reporting exponentially rising case numbers. And in October, the numbers stopped being statistics and became something that overwhelmed the capacity of language to describe. In October 1918, 195,000 Americans died from influenza. Not from the war, not from all causes combined. From influenza alone, in a single month, in a single country. To put this in context, the United States lost approximately 117,000 soldiers in the entirety of the First World War. The flu killed nearly twice that number in 31 days. Coffins became impossible to obtain. Undertakers were working around the clock and still falling behind. In Philadelphia, which would emerge with the highest death rate of any American city, the scenes were apocalyptic in the literal sense. Bodies were being stored in homes because the morgues were full. The smell of decomposition drifted through entire neighborhoods. People died alone, in their beds, in the streets, because there was nobody left healthy enough to help them. The Philadelphia story is the most damning indictment of wartime censorship in the entire history of the pandemic, and it deserves to be told in full. By late September 1918, the second wave had already been raging in Boston for a month. The medical community in Philadelphia was acutely aware of what was coming. A public health expert named Howard Anders begged the city's newspapers to warn the population that a planned Liberty Loan Parade, a massive public event designed to sell war bonds scheduled for September 28th, was a catastrophically bad idea. The parade was expected to draw hundreds of thousands of people into close physical contact along the streets of the nation's third-largest city, at the precise moment when the flu was spreading exponentially through the population. Anders told the press that the parade would be, in his words, a ready-made inflammable mass for a conflagration. The newspapers refused to publish his warning. The parade went ahead. 2 miles of marchers and military bands moved through streets packed with spectators who pressed in from both sides. It was a magnificent display of patriotic fervor, and it was a biological catastrophe. Within 72 hours, every single hospital bed in every one of Philadelphia's 31 hospitals was filled. Nurses reportedly turned down $100 bribes from desperate families trying to get their loved ones admitted. Within a week, 4,500 people had been infected. In 6 weeks, 12,000 were dead. Some historians put the number as high as 14,500. Steam shovels were brought in to dig mass graves. The newspapers that had refused to print the doctor's warnings now ran front-page stories with headlines like, "Worry is useless. Talk of cheerful things instead of disease." The Philadelphia Inquirer urged citizens to remain calm and keep buying war bonds. People were dying in the streets outside the newspaper offices as these words were set in type. The censorship apparatus that produced this catastrophe was not accidental. It had been carefully constructed over the preceding year and a half. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the Wilson administration moved swiftly to control the flow of information. The Espionage Act of 1917 made it a federal crime to say or print anything that could be construed as harmful to the war effort, with penalties of up to 20 years in prison. The Sedition Act of 1918 went further, making it unlawful to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, or abusive language about the government of the United States. Woodrow Wilson himself never once made a public statement about the influenza pandemic throughout its entire duration. The most powerful man in America, presiding over the worst biological catastrophe in his nation's history, said nothing. Not a word. His Committee of Public Information, headed by the journalist George Creel, had created a propaganda infrastructure so pervasive and effective that the self-censorship of the press had become reflexive. Editors did not wait to be told to suppress the flu stories. They knew what was expected of them, and they complied. The result was a population that went into the worst months of the pandemic almost entirely unprepared and almost entirely uninformed. In city after city across America, the pattern repeated itself. Public health officials downplayed the danger. Newspapers buried the story or ran reassuring headlines that bore no relationship to the reality in the hospitals. As late as September 1918, the El Paso Herald was publishing articles headlined, "Vicious Rumors of Influenza Epidemic Will Be Combated," presenting the growing crisis as a problem of misinformation rather than disease. The gap between what the medical community knew and what the public was being told was not a minor communications failure. It was a policy decision, made at the highest levels of government, that cost tens of thousands of American lives. In Europe, the situation was no different, and in some respects worse. Britain, France, and Italy had been at war for 4 years by the time the second wave hit, and their censorship apparatus was far more entrenched. The British head of public health, Arthur Newshome, privately acknowledged the severity of the epidemic, but publicly told Britons simply to carry on. Imposing the quarantine measures necessary to contain the pandemic would be too detrimental to the war economy. When the British Prime Minister himself fell severely ill with influenza during a morale-boosting trip to Manchester in September 1918, government officials and newspaper proprietors conspired to conceal it. The Manchester Guardian reported that he had caught a severe chill in a rainstorm. In Italy, the newspaper Corriere della Sera was legally prohibited from publishing daily death tolls. German General Erich Ludendorff, watching his army disintegrate from the combined effects of Allied military pressure and influenza, was frantic to prevent the Allies from learning the extent to which the flu had destroyed his forces' fighting capacity. Everyone was hiding the same catastrophe from everyone else, and the hiding was killing people on all sides. What makes the censorship story particularly grotesque is the irony encoded in the name Spanish flu itself. Spain was neutral. Spain had no wartime censorship of its press. When the disease struck in May 1918, hitting, among others, King Alfonso XIII, his prime minister, and several cabinet ministers simultaneously, Spanish newspapers reported it freely and in detail. The rest of the world, deprived of honest reporting about what was happening within their own borders, read the Spanish accounts and concluded that the epidemic must be centered in Spain. They named the disease after the country that had simply been honest about it. The nations that were most aggressively covering up the pandemic gave their silence a name and pinned it on the one country that had told the truth. In October 1918, a Spanish health official wrote a letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association protesting the name. "We were surprised to learn that the disease was making ravages in other countries, and that people there were calling it the Spanish grippe. Why Spanish? This epidemic was not born in Spain, and this should be recorded as a historic vindication." The vindication never really came. A century later, the misnomer still stands. In Russia, the epidemic arrived via the Trans-Siberian Railway and the corridors of civil war. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had plunged the country into internal conflict, and the resulting chaos, collapsed infrastructure, mass displacement of populations, acute shortages of food and medicine, created ideal conditions for the virus to spread unchecked. From Russia, it moved through northern Asia, arriving in India in September, flaring again in China in October. In India alone, the death toll from the 1918 pandemic would eventually reach estimates of 12 to 17 million, a number so staggering that it strains comprehension, a number that represents more deaths than India suffered in the entirety of the Second World War. The subcontinent's dense population, limited medical infrastructure, and colonial governance that consistently prioritized economic extraction over public health created conditions of almost perfect vulnerability. In West Africa, the virus followed the coast and then moved inland along rivers and railway lines. In South Africa, it arrived in September on ships returning members of the South African Native Labour Corps from France, men who had traveled halfway around the world to support a war being fought by empires that regarded their lives as expendable, and who came home carrying the pathogen that those empires had failed to contain or even honestly report. From South Africa, it traveled north along the Zambezi River, reaching Ethiopia in November. In the Pacific, islands that had maintained extraordinary geographical isolation for centuries were devastated within weeks of the first contact. Western Samoa lost approximately 22% of its entire population. In some remote Alaskan villages, mortality approached 85% of adults. Entire communities effectively wiped out. The survivors too few and too sick to bury their dead before winter closed in. Through all of this, the medical establishment remained largely helpless, still arguing about bacteria. The great bacteriologists of 1918 were not stupid men. They were working at the absolute frontier of medical knowledge, using the best tools available to them. Those tools were simply inadequate to the task. The microscopes of 1918 could not resolve objects as small as a virus. The germ theory of disease was only decades old. The concept of a filterable virus, an infectious agent so minute it passed through the finest laboratory filters, was theoretical, barely speculative. In October 1918, two scientists at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, Nicole and Labai, first formally proposed that the pathogen responsible for the pandemic was an infectious agent of infinitesimal dimensions, a virus. Their hypothesis was correct. It would not be confirmed until 1933, when the first human influenza virus was finally isolated in the laboratory. By then, the pandemic was 15 years in the past, and tens of millions were already dead. The autumn of 1918 ended, as autumns do, and the second wave began to recede in November. The armistice on November 11th, the end of the war, produced celebrations in the streets of every Allied city, crowds pressing together in exactly the conditions that epidemiologists had spent months trying to prevent. Some historians believe the armistice celebrations seeded the third wave that would emerge in early 1919. By December, much of Europe and North America reported declining case numbers. Australia, which had maintained strict quarantine measures throughout, lifted its restrictions in early 1919. The worst, or what people believed was the worst, appeared to be over. They were almost right, but not quite. The war ended on November 11, 1918. In the streets of London, Paris, New York, and Washington, people poured out of their homes and offices and factories in a delirium of relief and celebration. They had survived 4 years of industrialized slaughter. They had endured the artillery barrages and the poison gas and the grinding misery of the trenches. They pressed together in vast, joyful crowds, embracing strangers, singing, weeping, dancing in the streets. They breathed on each other, and in doing so, an unknown number of them passed the virus to people who had somehow escaped it during the catastrophic autumn months, seeding what many historians believe became the third wave of the pandemic. The celebration of the armistice and the end of the plague occupied the same moment in history, and neither the revelers nor the soldiers pouring off the returning troop ships understood that the biological catastrophe they were celebrating surviving was not, in fact, over. The third wave arrived in the last week of January 1919. It crept into New York quietly, without the explosive simultaneous appearance in multiple ports that had announced the second wave. The armies of the great powers were disbanding, and millions of soldiers were going home, traveling by ship, by rail, by whatever means were available, carrying with them the accumulated biological experiences of 4 years at war, including a relationship with the 1918 virus that varied from individual to individual and unit to unit. Some had been infected in the spring wave and carried partial immunity. Some had survived the autumn wave and carried stronger protection. Some had somehow, improbably, never encountered the virus at all and traveled home as immunological blanks, susceptible to whatever form the pathogen was now wearing. The movements of these demobilizing armies were the transmission pathways of the third wave, just as the deployments of those same armies had seeded the first and second. Paris, in the winter of 1919, was the center of the world. The great powers were assembling there to negotiate the peace that would define the shape of the 20th century, and the city was crowded with diplomats, politicians, journalists, fixers, lobbyists, and hangers-on of every description. The Paris Peace Conference drew together the leaders of the victorious Allied powers: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, along with delegations from dozens of nations, all competing to carve up the post-war world according to their interests. And into this gathering, in the late winter and early spring of 1919, the third wave of the pandemic arrived uninvited. On the night of April 3, 1919, Woodrow Wilson was seized by violent, uncontrollable spasms of coughing. His personal physician, Dr. Cary Grayson, was so alarmed by the severity and suddenness of the attack that he initially suspected the president had been poisoned. The French capital was full of competing factions, secret meetings, and paranoid rumors. Assassination attempts were not beyond imagination. But it was not poison. Wilson had influenza. He was put to bed at the Hôtel du Prince Murat and lay there for days, his fever rising, his coughing so severe that it interfered with his breathing, his mental state deteriorating. Those who attended him described a man who was not simply ill, but who seemed to undergo some kind of cognitive transformation. He became confused, obsessive about trivial details of the hotel furnishings, convinced that French spies were hiding in the rooms around him. His chief usher, Erwin Hoover, later wrote that the change in the president's personality was dramatic and deeply disturbing. What happened in the negotiations at Paris after Wilson's illness is one of the most consequential and contested questions in modern history. Before April 3rd, Wilson had been the most powerful voice at the conference for a moderate peace, a peace that would not humiliate Germany so completely as to produce the resentments and instabilities that could generate another war. He had been adamant, unyielding, willing to go to the mat for his 14 points, for the principle of self-determination, for a settlement that would be just rather than merely punitive. Clemenceau, who wanted Germany destroyed as a potential rival, had been furious with Wilson's resistance, reportedly accusing him of being pro-German. And then Wilson got sick. When he returned to the negotiating table, he was not the same man. He caved. He abandoned point after point, concession after concession, accepting terms he had previously rejected outright. The Treaty of Versailles that emerged from Paris imposed on Germany a formal admission of total guilt for the war, crushing reparations that would take decades to pay, and the loss of significant territory. Wilson's own aide, William Bullitt, resigned in protest, writing that the treaty had delivered the suffering peoples of the world to new oppressions and a new century of war. He was right. The scholars who argue that Wilson's influenza attack at the crucial moment of the Paris negotiations contributed to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and thus, indirectly, to the conditions that produced Adolf Hitler and the Second World War, are not making an outrageous claim. They are making a historically serious one. The third wave burned through the spring of 1919 and was declared finished in the Northern Hemisphere by May. Japan, however, experienced its own third epidemic wave at the end of 1919, extending into 1920. The final chapter of a catastrophe that had unfolded across 25 months and reached every inhabited landmass on Earth. By the time the pandemic was definitively over, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people were dead. The uncertainty in that estimate is itself a measure of the chaos. In many parts of the world, record-keeping had simply collapsed under the weight of the disaster. The final death toll of the 1918 to 1920 pandemic exceeded the combined military and civilian deaths of the First World War. It exceeded the death toll of the Second World War. It may have exceeded the death toll of any other single event in recorded human history, outside of the Black Death of the 14th century. And yet, within a generation, the world had largely forgotten it. The forgetting was not accidental. The pandemic ended at almost exactly the same moment as the war, and the war, with its flags and heroes and defined enemies and narrative of sacrifice and victory, consumed all the available cultural and emotional space. There were no monuments to the dead of the influenza pandemic. There were no memorial days, no parades for the survivors, no official recognition of what had happened. The disease had killed in a way that made no narrative sense, random, invisible, striking the young and strong rather than the old and weak, arriving and departing without explanation, leaving no clear victors and no clear villains. Governments that had actively suppressed information about the pandemic were not inclined to memorialize it. Newspapers that had downplayed and lied about its extent were not eager to revisit their failures. The collective decision to forget was not made consciously by any individual or institution. It emerged from the convergence of exhaustion, shame, and the overwhelming human desire to move forward rather than to account. For decades, the 1918 virus existed only as a ghost. Its effects were written in the demographic data, the missing cohort of young adults in census records across the world, the strange patterns in mortality statistics, the unexplained resilience to influenza of people who had been young adults in 1918. But the virus itself was gone. Or so everyone believed. In 1951, a young Swedish-born microbiologist named Johan Holton was studying at the University of Iowa when he overheard a virologist make an offhand remark. The clue to understanding the 1918 virus might be found in the bodies of its victims, preserved by permafrost in the remote Arctic. Holton became obsessed. He researched the pattern of the pandemic in Alaska, where some communities had been struck with a ferocity that beggared description. He found records of a tiny Inuit village on the Seward Peninsula called Teller Mission, later renamed Brevig Mission, where the influenza had arrived on a single November day in 1918, possibly carried by men delivering supplies from a neighboring settlement, and had killed 72 of the village's 80 adults within 5 days. 85% of the adult population dead in less than a week. The survivors, too sick and too few to dig proper graves, had appealed to the territorial government, which sent gold miners from Nome to drive steam points into the permafrost on a hillside and melt a hole large enough for all the dead, 12 feet wide, 25 feet long, 6 feet deep. The bodies had been buried there, and the permafrost had closed over them. Holton traveled to Brevig Mission in 1951, obtained permission from the village elders, and opened the mass grave. He found what he was looking for: preserved tissue, bodies that the permafrost had held against decay for 33 years. He took samples. He brought them back to his laboratory. And then, nothing. The technology of 1951 was not equal to the task. Holton could find no viable virus in his samples. The expedition had been scientifically premature. He moved on to other work, became a pathologist, and spent 4 decades watching the science of virology advance without him. The mass grave in Brevig Mission remained sealed on its wind-swept hillside, and the 1918 virus remained a mystery. Then, in the summer of 1997, Holton, now 72 years old, retired, his scientific career long behind him, picked up a journal and read an article by a molecular pathologist named Jeffrey Taubenberger. Working at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C., Taubenberger had managed to extract and partially sequence RNA from the lung tissue of 2 soldiers who had died in the autumn of 1918, whose tissue samples had been preserved in the Institute's archives in formalin-fixed, paraffin-embedded blocks for nearly 80 years. The sequencing was incomplete. The technology of 1997 could read only fragments of the viral genome. But it was a beginning, a fingerprint, the first direct molecular evidence of what the 1918 virus actually was. Holton read the paper and immediately wrote to Taubenberger. He explained who he was, what he had found in 1951, and what he proposed to do. He was going back to Brevig Mission. He was going to open the grave again. He had $3,200 in his savings account, which was enough to cover the costs. He did not wait for institutional funding or committee approval. He bought his ticket. In August 1997, Holton arrived in Brevig Mission. The village elders gave him permission again. He hired 4 young men from the village to help him dig, and they went back to the hillside grave. At a depth of 7 feet, Holton's shovel struck something unexpected: a body in extraordinary condition. The permafrost had done its work over 79 years with remarkable fidelity. The woman was young, perhaps in her mid-20s when she died, and she had been obese. Her body fat had acted as an additional layer of insulation, protecting her internal organs from the brief summer thaws that had compromised other bodies at shallower depths. Her lungs, when Holton reached them, were almost perfectly preserved. He removed them with a pair of garden shears he had borrowed from his wife, wrapped them carefully, and shipped them to Taubenberger's laboratory in separate packages as a precaution against loss. He named her Lucy. 10 days later, Taubenberger called. Lucy's lungs contained viable genetic material from the 1918 virus. Not just fragments, enough material to sequence the complete genome many times over. The pathologist, who had spent 46 years waiting for science to catch up with his obsession, had found, at 72 years old, the key to unlocking the greatest biological mystery of the 20th century. The sequencing work that followed, culminating in the complete characterization of the 1918 virus genome by 2005, produced findings that transformed virology. The virus was confirmed to be an H1N1 influenza A strain, a subtype of the same family of viruses that causes seasonal influenza today. But its specific configuration, the arrangement of its surface proteins and its polymerase genes, revealed something that had been debated for decades. The 1918 virus had originated in birds. It had made the jump from an avian host to humans, probably in the years or months before 1918, accumulating the adaptations that allowed it to replicate in human respiratory tissue and spread from person to person. This was not merely a historical curiosity. It was an explanation of the virus's extraordinary lethality. Human immune systems, having never encountered anything closely related to this avian-derived pathogen, had no ready defenses. The virus was essentially alien to the human immune landscape of 1918. And the specific genetic features identified in the reconstructed 1918 virus, the configurations of its hemagglutinin and neuraminidase surface proteins, the structure of its polymerase complex, explained why it killed young adults at such catastrophic rates. The cytokine storm hypothesis, long theorized, was confirmed at the molecular level. The 1918 virus triggered immune responses so violent that lungs filled with fluid and people drowned from within. The stronger the immune system, the more catastrophic the overreaction. Youth was a death sentence. All of this, the genome, the molecular mechanism of death, the avian origin, the reconstruction of the virus itself in a biosafety level 4 laboratory at the CDC in 2005, came from the preserved lungs of a young Inuit woman who had died on a hillside in Alaska in November 1918. And from the obsession of a retired pathologist who had read the right journal article at the right moment and decided to get on a plane with $3,000 and his wife's garden shears. The elders of Brevig Mission, when they gave Halton permission to open the grave a second time, told him they were glad to help, not just for themselves, but for the whole world. They were right. The woman Halton called Lucy, whose actual name was never recorded, whose death was one of 72 in 5 days in a village of 80, whose lungs had spent nearly 8 decades perfectly frozen in the Alaskan permafrost, turned out to hold the master key to understanding the worst biological catastrophe in modern human history. And Albert Gitchell, the cook from Kansas, the man at the beginning of the story, the unremarkable young soldier who walked into a sick bay on a flat, cold morning in March 1918, what of him? He recovered. His name appears in the medical records of Camp Funston, one sick call among thousands, a data point in a data set that would eventually swell to encompass 500 million infected and 100 million dead. He did not know, could not have known, that he was the opening note of the most terrible song the 20th century would sing. He got sick, he got better, and he went on with his life in the middle of a war, in the middle of a country that was not allowed to tell the truth about what was happening to it. He was nobody. He was everybody. He was the beginning, and the beginning, as beginnings always do, became everything that came after. The blue-faced soldiers drowning in their own lungs, the mass graves in Philadelphia and Alaska and India, the president in his Paris hotel room raving about spies, the old man with his wife's garden shears standing over a frozen grave on a windswept hillside, looking for a ghost. The ghost of a pathogen. The ghost of a century. The ghost of all the lives that might have been different, all the deaths that might not have happened if the world had been honest about what it knew and brave enough to act on that knowledge while there was still time to act. It was not. And so the cook from Kansas changed the world.